Every vehicle on this list broke a rule to exist, and rarely the same rule twice. One manufacturer welded fake seats into a truck bed to dodge a tax code. Another built a real, mechanically locking four-wheel drive system, smaller than anyone thought was possible. None of these 10 followed the rulebook for what a 4x4 is supposed to be, and that refusal is what makes them outlaws. Let's start with the one that never even made it to American shores. Number 10. Kia Retona. We start with a vehicle most Americans have never seen in person, and there is a very specific reason for that. The Kia Retona never came to the United States. Not once. Not in any form. Built by Asia Motors, a Kia affiliate with deep roots in South Korean military contracts, the Retona was engineered as a civilian spin-off of Kia's K131 military Jeep platform, the same lineage that had replaced older Korean army vehicles through the 1980s. It shared chassis architecture with the first-generation Kia Sportage convertible, which is why the two vehicles feel like distant cousins if you look closely at the doors and greenhouse. Production ran from 1997 to 2001, with a 2-liter turbo diesel making around 83 horsepower, paired to a 5-speed manual, sending power through part-time 4-wheel drive with manually locking front hubs. A rigid rear axle rode on 200mm of ground clearance, with approach and departure angles of 33 and 31 degrees, numbers that would embarrass most modern crossovers, wearing off road badges purely for marketing. Its outlaw credentials come from a different direction than most of this list. It was never officially banned by any regulator. It was simply never allowed in, a casualty of Kia's decision to sell its budget military, derived off-roader across Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, while reserving the tamer, more profitable Sportage for American dealerships. A 2006 German owner survey called its long-term reliability abysmal, and Rust ate through early production examples faster than owners could patch it. Off-road, in short bursts, none of that mattered. It climbed like it was still wearing camouflage. The Retona itself replaced an earlier Asia Motors model called the Rockster, and in 2000 Kia gave it a mid-cycle facelift, badged the Retona Cruiser, adding a revised grille, better rust protection on the underbody, and a 2-liter gasoline option, alongside the existing diesel, before quietly killing the entire nameplate in the early 2000s with no direct successor. Kia's own marketing at the time placed it directly against the Suzuki Jimny and the Lada Niva, an odd trio of budget off-roaders competing for the same buyer, who wanted genuine capability without a genuine badge to brag about. Total global production landed somewhere in the tens of thousands over its full run, a rounding error next to the millions of Sportages that eventually replaced it in Kia's lineup, and never looked back toward off-road capability again. Today, finding one outside Korea, Europe, or the Middle East is close to impossible, and finding one in drivable condition anywhere is rarer still, given how aggressively the body panels corroded in humid climates. Military Jeep DNA, terrible reliability. Worth it. Number 9. DKW Munga. The DKW Munga never had a real chance at the American market, and honestly, it almost did anyway. Built by Auto Union in Ingolstadt, West Germany, from 1956 to 1968, the Munga was developed specifically for the newly reformed Bundeswehr, which needed a rugged Land Rover-style off-roader fast after West Germany rejoined NATO. The name itself is pure German engineering pride, an acronym for Mehrzweck Universal Geländewagen mit Allradantrieb, roughly translating to multi-purpose universal cross-country vehicle with all-wheel drive. Under the boxy, sloped front fenders sat a 3-cylinder, 2-stroke engine, initially 896 cubic centimeters, producing 36 horsepower, later stretched to 980 cubic centimeters and 44 horsepower as military demands grew heavier. 4-wheel drive was permanent, not selectable, backed by a low-range creeper gear so extreme its lowest ratio topped out around 3 kilometers per hour, useful for nothing except crawling straight up a hillside. It could climb a genuine 70% grade and ford 500 millimeters of standing water without stalling. Nearly 46,750 units were built across the Munga, 4, 6, and 8-seat variants, serving West German border police, the Dutch army, and several other NATO forces through the late 1970s. Here is the twist almost nobody knows. In 1958, DKW actually brought the Munga to the Los Angeles Auto Show and presented it to American buyers under the name Bronco, a full 2 years before Ford ever touched that word. No US import deal ever materialized. Ford, whether by coincidence or careful market research, revived the name for its own off-roader less than a decade later, and the rest became automotive trivia buried under 6 decades of dust. Civilian versions found a second life entirely separate from military service, adopted widely for agricultural and forestry work across West Germany, and exported in meaningful numbers to South America and South Africa, anywhere poor roads made genuine four-wheel drive a necessity rather than a luxury. Endurance became part of its legend when former racing driver Ilse Theure drove a stock Munga 17,000 kilometers from Tangier through the Sahara all the way to Cape Town in 1959, proving the little two-stroke could survive terrain that stopped far more expensive machinery cold. By 1968, the Volkswagen Iltis replaced it in Bundeswehr service, and the Munga faded into the exact kind of Cold War obscurity that keeps automotive historians endlessly fascinated. Did Ford basically steal the name Bronco? Number 8. Daihatsu Rocky/Taft. Daihatsu sold cars in America for exactly 5 years, and the Rocky was one of only 3 vehicles it ever brought here. The Daihatsu Rocky traces its bloodline directly back to the 1974 Daihatsu Taft, one of the earliest small 4x4s chasing the Land Cruiser formula on a fraction of the budget. 6-liter fuel injected 4-cylinder making 94 horsepower, a 5-speed manual with genuine low-range gearing, and full ladder frame construction, shrunk into a compact 2-door convertible body that undercut nearly everything else on the lot. It was aimed squarely at the Suzuki Sidekick and the Geo Tracker, and in Daihatsu's more optimistic sales projections, at the Jeep Wrangler itself. Daihatsu entered the American market selling just 3 vehicles total: the tiny Charade sedan, the off-road only Hijet, and the Rocky, just as a brutal economic recession gutted demand for small imported cars nationwide. By 1992, after only 5 model years and a sales collapse that saw volume drop over 40% in a single year, Daihatsu pulled every single vehicle it sold in the United States and left the country entirely. It has never come back, and there is no indication it ever will, since parent company Toyota has no interest in competing against its own lineup. That decision makes every American spec Rocky a genuine automotive orphan, a 4x4 with no factory support, no parent company on this continent, and an increasingly fragile parts supply chain. Owners today lean entirely on Daihatsu Rugger, Feroza, and Taft networks overseas, just to keep original examples running 2, 3, sometimes 4 decades later. The Taft nameplate itself stayed in production across various export markets, including a long Indonesian run, well into the 2000s under names like Feroza, Rugger, and simply Taft, depending on which continent it landed on. In Europe, an even more upscale version called the Bertone Free Climber swapped in BMW petrol and turbo diesel engines for a genuinely luxurious take on the same basic chassis. Back home in the United States, the Rocky's total sales run barely registered against contemporaries like the Suzuki Sidekick, and by the time Daihatsu pulled out entirely, most of its American dealer network had already quietly shifted inventory toward other Japanese brands. It survived a brutal recession that killed its own manufacturer's entire American presence outright, and it never got a second chance to prove the timing was the only real problem. Bad timing, or was Daihatsu doomed either way? Number 7. Suzuki Carry. The Suzuki Carry is not banned in the way most people imagine banned vehicles to be. It is banned by omission, a key truck engineered to a Japanese regulatory standard that America's federal safety rules were simply never written to accommodate in the first place. Production traces back to October of 1961, and the 4-wheel drive version, running a dual-range transfer case and a roughly 660 cubic centimeter engine in its modern form, has been hauling loads far beyond its footprint for well over half a century. In Japan, it is an unremarkable workhorse seen on every farm road and construction site. In the United States, It exists in a strange legal grey zone that most car buyers never encounter. Brand new units cannot be imported for road use under any circumstances, since they were never certified to federal motor vehicle safety standards, and even 25-year-old examples that clear the federal import exemption still face a confusing patchwork of state-level restrictions. Roughly a dozen states ban on road registration outright. Others cap speeds at 25 or 55 miles per hour on secondary roads only, and Texas requires the vehicle be specifically marked for agricultural use before it can touch pavement at all. So American farmers do exactly what American farmers have always done when a rule gets in the way of practical work. They buy them anyway, keep them confined to private property, and run them as workhorses that quietly outperform anything comparable, costing 4 times as much in fuel savings and cargo capacity alone. It is a 4x4 that is functionally legal to own outright and functionally illegal to drive on the very public roads it was engineered to travel across Japan. The Carry's own history stretches back to the Suzuki Carry of October 1961, a tiny semi-cab-over pickup running a 359 cubic centimeter, 2-stroke, 2-cylinder engine, and the nameplate has continued through 11 full generations since then without ever losing its core, key truck identity. When Japan expanded its key displacement limit from 550 to 660 cubic centimeters in March of 1990, Suzuki used the extra room to push the Carry's 4-wheel drive variant into genuinely useful farm and construction territory, adding dual-range gearing that let it crawl up muddy inclines that would strand a full-size pickup, missing the same low-end grunt. Parts availability remains one of its biggest advantages over rival K trucks, since decades of shared components across Suzuki's own. Every van line mean American owners can source brakes, bearings, and gaskets through any key specialist without waiting months for a container ship from Japan. Would you own a truck you can never legally drive? Nothing on this entire list broke the rules with more style or more sheer audacity than the Subaru Brat. Developed in Japan in 1977 at the direct personal request of Subaru of America's president. The Brat was built on the existing Lyon station wagon platform, which meant it carried standard 4-wheel drive, years before that became common on any compact pickup sold in America. 8-liter EA 8.1 by 1981, with an optional 94 horsepower turbocharged variant, added in 1983, that made the little truck genuinely quick in a straight line. None of those specifications explain why the Brat actually matters to automotive history. What matters is the chicken tax, a punishing 25% tariff the United States imposed in 1963 on imported light trucks as retaliation in an entirely unrelated poultry trade dispute with Europe. Subaru could not legally ship the Brat to America without a cargo bed attached, and unlike other Japanese manufacturers who shipped their trucks bedless and installed beds stateside to dodge the rule, Subaru's unibody design made that trick impossible. So Subaru did something no other manufacturer dared try. It welded 2 plastic, rear-facing jump seats directly into the cargo bed itself, complete with seatbelts and carpeting, reclassifying the entire vehicle as a passenger car under federal law rather than a light truck. 5% overnight, an enormous cost saving passed directly to buyers. The loophole worked so well that Subaru's own brochures proudly marketed the rear seats as fun seats, and Ronald Reagan reportedly kept one at his California ranch, riding it around informally for years. It was a legal maneuver disguised as a 4x4, and it worked for 16 straight years before Subaru quietly dropped the seats near the very end of production in 1994. Beyond the seats, the Brat packed genuinely odd engineering touches nobody else bothered with, including a spare tire mounted flat inside the engine bay itself, rather than under the cargo floor, adjustable front and rear suspension for load management, and eventually a factory Targa. Top option Subaru called the Halo twin roof. Exports to North America ended in 1987, and Subaru never built a true successor until the unrelated Baja arrived briefly in the early 2000s, carrying almost none of the original's cult appeal. Would you ride in that open bed jump seat today? Number 5. Luaz 969. Few vehicles on this entire list are stranger or more genuinely obscure to Western eyes than the Luaz 969, a Soviet Mini 4x4 born directly out of hard Cold War military necessity. Its direct ancestor, the Luaz 967, was developed after the Korean War when Soviet military planners realized their standard issue, Gaz-69, was far too large and far too heavy for genuine frontline casualty evacuation work under fire. The civilian 969, introduced in 1966 and moved into full production at the Lutsk automobile plant in western Ukraine from 1971 onward, inherited that same lightweight amphibious design philosophy, almost unchanged. Power came from an 887 cubic centimeter, air-cooled MiMZ V4 engine producing around 30 horsepower, later bumped to 1,197 cubic centimeters and 40 horsepower in the upgraded 969A variant, introduced in 1975. Unusually for a Soviet military-derived vehicle, it ran front-wheel drive as its base layout with selectable rear axle engagement, an arrangement almost nobody else in the world was using at the time, all wrapped in a fiberglass body specifically chosen to keep total weight low enough for genuine airborne parachute deployment. Combined military and civilian production ran into the tens of thousands before the line finally ended in 1992, a direct casualty of the Soviet Union's collapse and the supply chains that disintegrated along with it. Almost none of these vehicles ever left the Eastern Bloc during their production run, which is exactly why most Western enthusiasts have never seen one in person, let alone had the chance to drive one across open terrain. It was engineered from the ground up to survive a war. It simply could not survive the fall of the country that built it and kept its factories running. Prototype work on the original design began at NAMI, the Soviet National Automotive Institute, all the way back in 1958 under the designation NAMI 049, developed under military engineer Boris Futterman, specifically to answer a gap the standard Willys-style Jeep formula could not fill for airborne forces needing something light enough to drop by parachute directly onto a battlefield. The 969 line eventually spawned a hardtop panel van variant called the 969F, built in small numbers for utility work, and a final evolution, the 969M, nicknamed Volynyanka, after the region surrounding the Lutsk factory, added disc brakes with servo assist when it entered production in 1979. By 1982, the plant had assembled its 100,000th vehicle, a genuine milestone for a factory that started as a simple repair workshop for tractors and farm equipment barely 3 decades earlier. Which Cold War 4x4 do you wish we'd gotten? Number 4. Mitsubishi Pajero Mini. Mitsubishi took a Paris-Dakar rally champion and shrunk it down to fit inside a single Tokyo parking space. By the mid-1990s, Mitsubishi had already proven the full-size Pajero could win the Paris-Dakar rally outright, repeatedly, against factory-backed competition from across Europe. The Pajero Mini, launched in December of 1994, asked an entirely different question. What happens if you keep the badge and the boxy, round headlight styling, but shrink everything else down to fit inside Japan's strict key car regulations? The result ran a 659 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder engine, offered naturally aspirated at 52 horsepower, or turbocharged at 64 horsepower, the absolute maximum permitted under K regulations at the time. 4-wheel drive models added a genuine 2-speed transfer case and roughly 7 inches of ground clearance, numbers that quietly outperformed several vehicles twice its physical size and 3 times its price. At barely 10 feet long overall and under 1,800 pounds curb weight, it could outmaneuver a Suzuki Samurai inside a cramped parking structure while still crawling over terrain that would stop most modern crossovers dead in their tracks within minutes. It was never sold new in the United States, and given Mitsubishi's decision to end Pajero Mini production entirely in June of 2012, without any direct successor model, it never will be through any official channel. The only realistic path to American ownership today runs through the federal 25-year import rule, and even then, buyers are importing a vehicle purpose built for narrow Japanese city streets and rice paddy access roads, not American interstate highways built for triple-digit speeds. It borrowed a legendary rally-winning name and shrunk it down to K-car dimensions without shrinking the attitude that came attached to it. Mitsubishi built the Pajero Mini on the humble Miniter K car platform, rather than any true off-road architecture, yet still equipped four-wheel drive versions, with a dash-mounted digital inclinometer, a compass, and interior and exterior temperature gauges. Small touches clearly borrowed straight from the full-size Pajero's expedition-focused options list. Special editions leaned even harder into that identity, including an Iron Cross trim, a Desert Cruiser package, and a rugged-looking Duke variant, added in December of 1997 with heavier body cladding, and an upright grille referencing Mitsubishi's decades of Jeep CJ 3B license production in Japan. Nissan even sold a rebadged version called the Kicks through an OEM supply agreement, quietly extending the platform's reach into showrooms that had nothing to do with Mitsubishi at all. Tribute, or just a dilution of the name. Number 3. Fiat Panda. When Fiat launched the Panda in June of 1983, nobody had ever successfully engineered a real, mechanically locking four-wheel drive system into a transverse engine city car before that point. Fiat did not attempt the engineering alone. It partnered directly with Austrian off-road specialist Steyr-Puch, who designed and manufactured the entire drivetrain in-house, from the clutch through the gearbox to the rear differential and brakes, shipping the complete assembly to Fiat's Sicilian plant at Termini Imerese for final installation onto a reinforced chassis. The original 1983 version ran a 965 cubic centimeter engine, producing 48 horsepower, paired with a 5-speed manual transmission, featuring an ultra-low first gear meant purely for crawling, so low in fact that normal on-road driving began from second gear entirely, treating first as an emergency-only creeper ratio. A 1986 update swapped in Fiat's new Fire engine family, growing displacement to 999 cubic centimeters and 50 horsepower specifically for the four-wheel drive variant, while the rear suspension deliberately stayed, leaf-sprung even as the standard front-wheel drive Panda moved on to a more modern independent setup elsewhere in the range. What earns the Panda 4x4 a spot on an outlaw list is not any government ban. It is a flat refusal to respect its own category. This is a car so small that people still mistake it for oversized shopping cart on first glance. Yet Alpine farmers to this day refuse to sell theirs at any price, and stock Panda 4x4s regularly outclimb dedicated off-roaders costing 4 times as much brand new. Steyr-Puch quietly built the toughest small-scale four-wheel drive system in Europe, and hid it inside a car nobody outside the mountains ever took seriously. Limited editions like the 1987 Sisley, originally capped at 500 units before demand forced Fiat to make it permanent, added an inclinometer nicknamed the Pandometer, a roof rack, and headlamp washers, turning a farm tool into something closer to a cult fashion statement across parts of Europe. The nameplate proved so durable that Fiat still sells a Panda today, over 4 decades after Steyr-Puch's original engineering work. Real four-wheel drive, or all-wheel drive gimmicks, which do you trust? Number 2. Lada Niva. In 1971, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin personally ordered 2 separate state automobile manufacturers to solve a real practical problem plaguing rural regions, farmers and villagers who simply could not be reached fast enough by existing vehicles when something went wrong. Avtovaz won the resulting design competition, and the Lada Niva entered full production in 1977 under the internal designation VAZ2121, becoming the world's first mass-produced off-road vehicle built with unibody construction rather than a traditional separate ladder frame underneath. 6-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 76 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed manual transmission, a genuine low-range transfer case, a locking center differential, and fully independent front suspension, riding on 235mm of ground clearance from the factory floor. That specific combination let the Niva accomplish things almost no Western 4x4 of its era could reliably match. A single Niva operated continuously in Antarctica for more than a decade, covering over 40,000 kilometers of frozen terrain at temperatures as low as -54 degrees Celsius, without catastrophic failure. A lengthened version was actually airdropped by parachute directly onto polar ice to reach the North Pole in 1998, and a separate Niva climbed to 5,725 meters on a Tibetan mountainside the following year, setting a genuine altitude record for a motorized wheeled vehicle at the time. Over 2 million units have been built since 1977, and the basic mechanical platform, now marketed simply as the Lada 4x4, remains in continuous production today, making it one of the longest, unbroken production runs of any dedicated off-roader anywhere on Earth. It was designed to reach isolated farmers faster. It ended up reaching the literal top and bottom of the entire planet instead. Competition success followed just as quickly on the Paris-Dakar, Paris-Tunis, and Paris-Beijing rally routes, building a genuine enthusiast following in Western Europe that Soviet planners never specifically designed for, but happily accepted anyway. British importers even created their own upgraded trim packages called Cossack, and later Hussar, adding bull bars, alloy wheels, and semi-bucket seats to make the utilitarian Niva more palatable to UK buyers used to Land Rover levels of comfort. Even today, with zero crash safety rating from independent testing, none of that has stopped rural buyers across Russia, South America, and Eastern Europe from choosing it over modern alternatives that break down the moment sophisticated electronics meet genuine mud. Legend, or just nostalgia on wheels. Number 1. Suzuki Jimny / Samurai. No Mini 4x4 on Earth carries a bigger outlaw reputation than the Suzuki Samurai, and the story starts with genuinely enormous sales numbers. When it launched in the United States in 1985, for roughly $6,500, Suzuki sold nearly 50,000 units in its first year, then over 80,000 the year after. At one point in 1987, outselling the contemporary Jeep Wrangler 2-1. Then, in 1988, Consumer Reports published a review claiming the Samurai easily rolled over during an emergency double-lane change swerve test, and sales collapsed almost overnight, dropping from roughly 72,000 units the year before that report to under 2,000 units the very next year. Suzuki eventually filed a formal product disparagement lawsuit against Consumer Reports in 1996, and the case dragged through federal courts for well over a decade before a symbolic 2010 settlement was reached, in which neither side formally admitted fault. By then, the reputational damage to the Samurai nameplate in America was permanent and essentially unfixable. Suzuki kept selling the Samurai domestically until 1995, but every single Jimny generation built after that point, the GA and JB series, running clear through to today's current model, has never been officially sold new in the United States again through any authorized dealer. 5-liter, 101 horsepower power plant. The only legal path into America still remains the federal 25-year import rule, and Suzuki formally retired the entire global Jimny nameplate after the 2025 model year, quietly closing the book on a car that ultimately outlasted the very controversy that nearly killed it decades earlier. Government studies conducted well after the controversy, including data reviewed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, later found the Samurai's real-world rollover. Accident rate fell within a normal range compared to other small utility vehicles of its era. None of that reached nearly as many people as the original 1988 warning did, which is precisely why reputational damage of this kind almost never gets fully undone once it takes hold of public perception. The Jimny nameplate itself has run in continuous production since April of 1970, longer than any other small off-roader on Earth, evolving from a tiny 359 cubic centimeter two-stroke triple all the way through today's turbocharged key and a widebody. Sierra variants sold across nearly every market except the one that made it famous in the first place. Did one bad test ruin a great 4x4? 10 mini 4x4s. Tariffs killed some. Lawsuits killed others. One country collapsed before its own military. 4x4 could ever legally leave home. None of that made a single one of them worse machines. It just made them harder to own. Which one of these 10 outlaws makes your driveway? Drop it in the comments. And if you want to see the 4x4s that actually made it through American customs without a fight, our video on the most capable American 4x4s ever built is waiting right there for you now.